Hi, welcome to Cyber Monday. Joining me is my co-host, Mr. Dominic Vogel. Dominic, who's in the hot seat today?
Today we have our good friend Farshad Abasi, who's the CEO and founder of Forward Security.
Awesome. So I think we're going to have a multi-layered conversation with him, pardon the pun.
Yeah.
So I'm going to invite Farshad in. I'm going to jump in this chair, and we'll be right back.
Farshad, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to chat with Christian. I know we're pretty stoked for the conversation. I know we're going to cover so much ground here. So let's just get started.
It's great to have you.
Awesome. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So you do application security. Application is the first word. Tell our business leader audience what applications are.
Thanks, Christian. Yeah, it's interesting that you asked that. I find that often there's a lot of confusion, especially with the business owners when they come to us. They know they need security. They want that stuff that's running their business to be secure.
Yeah.
But there's confusion as to what is the application and what's the infrastructure that's running it. You know, oftentimes they'll come to us and they say, "Hey, I'd like a pen test." I'm like, "Well, what do you need pen tested? Do you need the company pen tested, or your network, or your application?" They're like, "What is the application?" Right?
Yeah.
The best way to describe it is essentially you have different when you have the system, right? There are different layers of that. You know, you have your infrastructure layer, right?
Yeah.
Often infrastructure is your network and your compute, your servers, that type of stuff, right? Then on top of the infrastructure, you have the platform services. And these days, there's a trendy word that's been around for the last few years. They call it PaaS, right? Platform as a service. And essentially, the platform layer it's often software, but it's the components that enable the application that goes above it to run. So it'll be things like your database server or your web server. But all those services that they themselves could be considered application, but really when you're talking about someone's business application is the other stuff that sits on top of that.
Right.
So if we looked at these layers, you have your infrastructure layer, or if it's in the cloud, it'd be your infrastructure as a service or your IaaS layer. Then you have the platform, that's your database, web services, all that type of stuff. Then you have the application layer, which is the custom service or code that's been designed to accomplish a specific business objective.
Yes.
And the way you approach these and view them and test them is fairly different. Different skill sets when you're looking at the infrastructure layer, different types of things you look for when you're looking at the platform layer, and different types of skill set and ways to break things when you're looking at the application.
So just really quickly then, what would be some examples of like an inward-facing application or software and an outward facing for your clients?
Yeah, oftentimes that's a good question. Oftentimes, all good questions. I'm sure. Oftentimes you'll have in-house, like we're reviewing a couple of them, not to mention any client names, but it'll be like accounting software, right? Like it's often internal facing, so that the company's staff are interacting with it, and it'll be exposed. Most nowadays everything is almost a web-based application. You no longer really have those thick client traditional. There are still lots of them out there, but it's less common. Most companies are leveraging web applications. Now, those web applications may be limited to internal staff, such as accounting or ERP software, which is not often externally exposed. And if it is, it'll be usually through a dedicated VPN tunnel or something that it's still internal.
Yes.
Yes, you're using it from home, but it's through an internal private tunnel for all that matters. Then external applications are often customer facing, right? So you might have a e-commerce application where you sell products to your customers, or you might have a dashboard for your clients to track progress of something you're building for them inside. So sometimes they might have an internal facing interface where the staff work on the project for the client, and then there'll be an external interface where the client can track the project across the different pipelines or parts of the workflow.
So you have software that you maybe develop in-house in your company that you can use and have outward-facing or inward-facing, and then you have software that you will license that somebody else has developed, and both require security, application security.
That's where it gets interesting.
That is where you come in, and that's where your company comes in. So what is application security?
That's a good question. So you mentioned a couple of things, right? Like stuff they're building and stuff they're buying. And that's exactly the case, right? Larger companies that have a mix of both because they're big enough to have developers that might make something for them and then might buy some things. Oftentimes in the smaller companies, they usually buy the packages because they're focusing on their core business, and their core business is not building applications. So it makes sense for them to buy something. But in both cases, you still have security issues that you need to think about, right? Because in this day and age, your most important assets are what?
intangible assets,
digital
right?
assets,
Digital assets.
and those
That's
digital
a good
assets.
question.
I mean, we're no longer in the dark ages where my company's assets are a bunch of paper or intellectual property that's written on paper and there's books and whatever, right?
Yes.
These days, even if you, no matter what business you're in, whether you're in financial business or you're doing e-commerce transactions, or whether you're an engineering company producing intellectual property, all those are going to be digital files, right?
Yes.
The engineering company is going to have a bunch of AutoCAD files and some other files that are served by some server, whether it's a file server or maybe it's a custom plan room server. I know a lot of architecture companies have plan rooms where the architects upload stuff and customers view them and all that.
Yeah.
That used to be all on paper, right?
Yes.
Blueprints, and they would deliver. So in this day and age, the most important companies, pretty much for most companies, are most important assets are digital.
Yes.
And of course, what is touching the digital assets is the application. So
Yes.
you've got the asset here, you've got the application that is interacting with it, and then underneath the application, in order for the application to run, it needs the platform and it needs the infrastructure.
Big question we ask is, how long can your business go without having access to your information, your most important asset?
Exactly.
How long
Those
can
are
you
some of the
remain in
cons-
business?
Yeah, and when you're looking at the impact, so this is the way we usually work with clients. We start from identifying the asset, right? We're like, should I worry about application security? Well, let's have that conversation. If you have assets that are important enough, then you should worry about it, right? If your application is running out there and there's no assets or no impact to your business, then you don't worry about it, right?
Yeah.
And how do you determine impact to the asset is based on usually three factors. It's based on your reputation, like if that asset wasn't available to your internal employees or external customers, what would be the reputational damage for you?
Right.
The second thing is what would be the financial damage to your organization if that was not available, whether it was down or was deleted or whatever that would be, right?
Yeah.
And then the third one would be impact, how many users would be impacted, whether it's your internal users or whether it's customers, right? So once you kind of look at those three, and if you say, yeah, I'm going to have either a huge reputational impact or a huge financial impact or huge customer impact, or maybe even just one of them. If any of one of those is high for you, then that's something you should worry about. Now, if it's medium, okay, yeah, you should also think about it. But if it's low across the board, then it's really up to you whether you should care about application security or not, right? So that's how usually we start the conversation.
So the reason to pay attention to this is because there's business impact if there are issues, security issues. And before you get to your question, and I apologize, but
He's taking over.
I'm absolutely taking over this
It's
interview.
fantastic just watching the dialogue, yeah.
What are we securing these applications from?
Oh, yes.
He's on a roll, that's another good question.
Right, yeah, that's a really good question.
So many
because
good questions.
Oftentimes, I think you may know that, like oftentimes most business owners think that you're protecting them from hackers and attackers that are outside, right? But in that, and it's I've got news for them. And these in this day and age, it's not you're not protecting yourself from outside attackers. You also have to worry about malicious insiders. Lots of your employees may be unhappy with their job, disgruntled employees. They're not getting paid well. There's some other reason they don't like you, whatever it is. That they have direct access to those assets. That's actually quite a bit, quite a bit of a risk there. And forget about your employees. Nowadays, people are getting viruses or malware. So someone will send them an email. They open the attachment, and then the computer gets infected. Now that internal computer is an agent for the attacker to attack your systems.
Yes.
So you no longer you have to throw away the mentality that we're only worrying about the outside. So we're going to put a firewall here. Our application is in here. We don't have to worry about and I run into this all the time. A lot of companies put all these services on the inside, and they say, well, I'm not using encryption between these services or authentication. These are all inside my inside network, right? They only enable that security on the outside link.
Right.
But then on the inside, if you get malware, one computer gets infected, that computer is an agent that can directly go talk to all of your unauthentic, unprotected services, right? So yeah, it is, you have to worry about agents inside and outside, your employees as well as attackers.
Very well said.
That's what's so interesting about this the broader application security piece, and which there's so many layers to it. And for companies which, let's say their bread and butter is delivering apps, so whether that be a web application, mobile app. I know you and I have had this discussion as well, and this is commentary on a broader perspective as well. But so many businesses are focusing on sort of rushing it out to market, focusing on functionality
For good reason, right?
And for good
They're
reason.
a business. They need to make money. The functions need to work, right? I mean, I've been there.
Broadly speaking, how can businesses better balance that, rather than just going from that, because there's that concept of security debt, which you can, we'll keep pumping it out and we'll deal with security later. But sooner or later, that debt becomes so massive, and it ends up being called out in the event of a significant breach or significant vulnerability, what have you. There's this, eventually that debt gets called. So what's some sort of pragmatic views or viewpoints for businesses which are currently right now focusing just on functionality and getting stuff out, and how they can better balance that?
I've got a good analogy from like the real world, right? Like forget about the security world, but like if you're building a building, maybe the alarm system and that security system is really expensive and you don't have money to install it right now. Right? But if you allow conduits in your blueprint, like when you're designing the blueprint, leave the conduits and the pathways where you can later install the alarm system. When 5 years from now, when you do have the money to put the alarm system, it'll be a lot cheaper because you've already got all the conduits and you've got all the placement. You can just go get the alarm company to come in and install it, right? But if you never thought about it, then I'm gonna have to be like, oh, well, you already finished this building. I have to drill through these walls and I have to do this, and that's gonna be a lot more expensive to do it. So my answer to that is, well, fine, if you're busy and you don't have resources to build the security, that's fine. At least plan for it. At least take into account, think about like, okay, I'm building this kind of application. My first year, I'm going to spend all my resources and time on building functionality, but I'm going to allow in my architecture that there's room to incorporate that, and maybe incorporate some of the basics, maybe put the alarm system on the front door at least, right? And then for the rest of it, go, okay, well, I've allowed the boxes and everything else for the rest of it, and then when it comes time, I'll install the rest of it. I don't need it. So don't leave it out completely. Do some planning, implement as just the basics, right? And I think everyone does the basics, but what I find is that it's not very well planned out. And again, look, using the physical world example, the world of architecture and building design has matured so much that no one ever goes out and builds a building without a blueprint, right?
That's
like
right.
No one does that. No one goes, oh, I'm going to build this apartment. I'm just going to start laying bricks and concrete, right? No one does that. But in the software world, because it's such a new industry, they're doing. They call themselves software engineers, but they're not following any engineering practices. And engineering would require you to have a blueprint, right? So this is the paradigm shift that we need to have: is that lay out a nice blueprint, accommodate the base hygiene requirements in your original architecture, and then build it later with that in mind.
And like, is that current mindset then? Is that from the people who are like the product managers in the business, or is that on the software engineering side as well, or is it
everyone?
Sort of, is everyone right across the board?
I chalk it up to being a new industry. Like new, it's like compared to
in the grand
software has been around since like 70s, 60s, whatever. But and looking
building
buildings has been around for hundreds of years, right? So, and when I was at university, we always talked about that because we were like, hey, we're going to be software engineers, and then the people in electrical engineers that were professional engineers would laugh at us. They're like, oh, well, we've got the ring and we've been doing this for like
engineers,
the whole process, right? We're not engineers. Like you guys don't really follow any process, right? So we're like, well, we're software engineers. We're like, so that's always been. But I think it is maturing. It will probably in 10 years from now we're going to look back at this, and I think things will be hopefully different.
Yeah, you mentioned an interesting piece earlier about the sort of the platform as a service, infrastructure as a service. That's very much thinking about the broader sort of relying on Amazon, AWS, or Microsoft Azure. Often that other sort of train of thought, which seems to be quite consistent in the broader business world, is that we're relying on AWS, therefore we're secure. All our security is in the cloud. Or same thing, we're leveraging Azure. Everything is good. We're secured in the cloud there. There's a concept called shared responsibility. Where can that, and again, AWS and Azure and many cloud service providers are very in tune with trying to promote that, but that seems to still fall on deaf ears with a lot of business owners or people who are just seeing it through a business lens. At a high level, what is shared responsibility, and why is it's in the cloud, it's secure, sort of approach wrong, and what can businesses do to sort of get that better balance?
Yeah, I'm going to use the building industry again as an example, right?
It's a good analogy.
When I was walking over here, I was looking at all the buildings downtown, and I'm like, they all have a security guy. They have the concierge, right? They have that. When you Concord Pacific or whoever builds the building, they have, hey, at the end you're going to have a front security guy, and the front door is closed. But does that mean that you should leave your apartment unlocked? Like,
no.
You don't do that. Just because the apartment building took care of some security for you, you don't just give up and like, well, they've got the security in the front of the building, I'm not going to lock my door of my apartment, right?
No,
That's sort of the same thing. When you put your stuff in Amazon, sure, Amazon takes care of that front door. They've got the concierge. They'll encrypt the hard drives for you. But, they're not going to take care of your application is your apartment. You're putting that in the building, right? Like, that's your responsibility to lock your door. Because there's an entrance through your application as well as there's an entrance through the front door. once they get to the front, well, if Amazon or whoever the cloud provider is takes care of that layer, that doesn't mean, okay, well, that doesn't mean that that's unpenetrable.
Doesn't mean that you're good.
You're good, right? Because they can get past the security. Maybe they can get past the security guy. Hopefully they won't, or hopefully some of those controls are good. But security, as you guys know, should be defense in depth, right?
Yes.
Layered security. So you have the front guy at the downstairs of the concierge in the lobby.
Yeah.
You lock your door. Maybe you put 2 locks on it, depending on how paranoid you are, right? So that, and then maybe inside your house you have a vault and you put your jewelry in the vault, right? So it doesn't end at the application. So even you might secure your application, then your data, you might want to put that data, further secure the database, right? Or further take your keys and put them in a vault, like a hardware security module, and even lock that down. So again, depends on how many jewels and how many $1,000,000 you have, or dollars you have in your apartment. Do you need a vault, and do you need to do additional security?
Right.
And then all goes back to the asset and the impact on the asset. The more is at risk, the higher the impact to the asset. The more locks and vaults and layers that you should be adding.
So and maybe expanding on that, if you're, let's say you're a tech company, again, your bread and butter is creating applications, web applications, cloud software as a service stuff, and you're trying to sell that to various enterprises, larger companies. What should those organizations look at doing to be able to demonstrate to some of these larger companies that they're at least taking some level of application security? What are some of the basics?
Yeah, it's interesting. So that's another
Good question, I know.
area of confusion. Good question. Yeah, you guys got lots of them.
Change the name of the show to Good
Good
Questions.
questions. 20 minutes of good questions. Yeah, it's essentially, it's funny because there's a lot of confusion. Companies come to us, they're like, oh, I've got SOC 2. Is that good enough? It's like, well, no. I mean, a lot, like I'm GDPR compliant. I see that. Last night I was shopping for a project management SaaS, and I'm like a security company, so I'm going to buy stuff that I'm an application. We run an application security company, so I would better get a SaaS that's done their work. And when I go to a company's webpage and they're like, oh yeah, we've got GDPR and SOC 2 and we're secure, I'm like, you don't even know application security. What I want to see is, are you doing secure software development? Are you doing pen testing on your application? Are you encrypting your application data at rest? There are, at the minimum, I want to see that you're doing an annual pen test, right? And I see that on some of them. I'm not going to promote them, but I went to a few of the web pages, and a couple of them, made me feel good. I'm like, yeah, these guys know what they're doing, because they're like, yeah, we do secure software development. I'm like, yep, there you go. Their developers are trained, secure SDLC. They do annual pen tests. There you go. And then they have a bug bounty program. All those, they encrypt their data at rest. They pay attention to how the users are authenticated and session management. Those are the kinds of details that I want to see, not that you have ISO 27001 or SOC 2, because those are very infrastructure oriented, process oriented. You might be doing that, but then you ignore, again, it's the same thing. You might have a security guard in the concierge in the lobby, but do you have the locks on the door? Do you have a vault?
Right.
And you may not need the vault. Right. You may not have $1 million in your apartment, but if you do, you should have a vault.
Right. So. No, exactly. And this to me also blends into that broader role in which we're seeing with the mainstream media now, in which data breaches are almost a daily occurrence.
Absolutely.
The more recent one being with Capital One. And I think there's part of it. There's good exposure in the fact that that's now mainstream, and it's hitting the faces of people who are non-security people. But there's often a lot of misinformation around that as well. And I'm curious to know sort of your opinion in terms of what were some lessons learned from Capital One, are there some elements which small or mid-sized businesses can take from that to make sure that they're at least dealing with some, or at least incorporating some lessons learned from a fairly high-profile data breach?
Yeah, and that's actually a really good case study for what we do. Is that oftentimes, that first of all, that attack involved a couple of different layers or a couple of different aspects.
Yeah.
Right? They leveraged an application security vulnerability. So they had it was a web application firewall, but it's an application. Forget what it did.
Yeah.
It was a web-based application that was running there.
Right.
So the attacker took advantage of a web application vulnerability. Once they took advantage of the web application vulnerability, and I don't want to get too technical, but it was a server-side request forgery.
Yeah.
So once you take advantage of that gives you by breaking the web application, it gives you access now to run commands on that machine. So then the second stage was to take advantage of a misconfiguration in the Amazon cloud.
Right.
So what happened is that particular machine was running under a user which had too much permission. So because why would you run a service, and that service would have permission to access every one of your storage places where you store your data? So they hadn't fine-tuned the permissions on the Amazon cloud side. So once the attacker was able to compromise through the web application, compromise that machine, then from there they were able to access all the storage folders or buckets, they call them in Amazon, and get access to all of those things. So this is a good use case for saying, hey, like you should do your application security, because if you had done pen testing and secured your application, they wouldn't have been able to compromise it, number one. But maybe if someone still did pen testing, nothing is 100%. Now, if you've done the proper Amazon security, right? If it's a shared responsibility model, right? You need to actually correctly set the permissions. Like you shouldn't create a user and give that user open wide access to everything, right? And permissioning is really important. And this is one of the things a lot of our clients that we work with, they don't want to do that. They look at I create them a role matrix, and I'm like, hey, these are the users and these are the services. This is what this user should do. They look at it like, oh, that's so complicated. Why do I need these? I just have one guy. He accesses everything, and then I have the production role. I'm like, no, like you need to have a security role, you need to have an administrator role, you need to have like at least 5 different roles, and then you need to map out who should access what service and then correctly implement that, right? So these are the kinds of use cases that sort of bring about the value of doing proper, doing your part and doing proper security on the cloud as well as the application. And again, goes back to security's defense in depth, right? So if you've done your application security, maybe they couldn't get in there. And then, but if they did, if you'd done your proper cloud security, then that would have been a second mitigating factor that wouldn't have allowed this attack to succeed.
That's really interesting, you know, and so I think even morphing that to another layer of abstraction of sorts, when we're talking about some of those concepts which were being missed, what are some questions maybe that business leaders or product managers can ask their dev team? Because often there's a disconnect in which, you know, the dev teams are very technical, and often, you know, they're reporting to someone who may not be as technical, and so there may be a disconnect there. What are some high-level questions then that business owners can ask, at least if there's someone developing that software in-house or if they're relying on a third party? What are some high-level questions that they can ask? I know you mentioned about like the pen testing and secure coding. Are there some other best practices that they should be trying to see if they exist?
I think the one question at the minimum they could ask the team is like, what security requirements have you considered, if any, right? If they're like, we haven't considered any security requirements, that's a good place to start, right? You should at least consider the minimum security. Like, yeah, we're going to have authentication. We're going to do it at least like maybe 2-factor authentication, or we're going to do X, Y, Z. And we're going to maybe have a web app. If we're not going to really harden the application, maybe we're going to put a web application firewall in front of it.
Right.
Or, you know, have you considered any security requirements, right?
Yes.
There are a lot of good resources for that. I was looking, you know, SANS, you guys all know who they are. They published the SWAT Secure Web Application. I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but it's a checklist. It's a real basic, simple place to start. It's like, you know, a couple pages, and it says, hey, for logging, check. Have you done this? For authentication, consider this. It's not heavy, and that I usually recommend that as a great place to start. If you've done nothing, go get the SANS checklist. Go through those, right? And then if you want to go further, then okay, cool. Have your developers had some secure development training, right? You know, there are a lot of good resources for that as well. OWASP, you know, the Open Web Application Security Project, global organization. They publish a lot of really, really good standards. They have a document. It's a standard called the Application Security Verification, ASVS, Application Security Verification Standard.
Yes.
And it provides a whole bunch of security requirements. In fact, it provides like almost 300 security requirements.
Wow.
You don't need to go implement all of those, right? Going back to what I said, put in the basic, put in the lock in the front door. Just go through that, and they actually group them by levels. They have level 1 requirements, level 2, and level 3. At the minimum, maybe implement the level 1. Well, start with the SANS one. It's very light. Once you've gone past that, maybe go to the level 1, and then work your way up from there, right? But do something. I think that's the question should be, have you taken any security requirements?
Yeah, and I think what I hear you saying is do it proactively, do security by design.
You don't have to do too much. Just do something. Think about it. That's awareness is step 1, right? And then you go from there.
Yeah, and it'll be less work and cheaper for you in the long run. So you might as well just start by putting it in by design in the first place, rather than
security by design. That's what we live by, right? Everything I do is by design. All the talks I do, everything is always incorporate the word by design, because doing things by design is really important in life, right? In general,
absolutely.
Like plan your life, design it. Don't just let it be random and happen to you, kind of thing.
That's awesome, Farshad. You know, there was just so many great topics we touched on there. Fantastic dialogue. I thoroughly enjoyed the first 10 minutes there.
So many more questions I wanted to ask.
So many more good questions.
I thought you did a great job. I mean, this is a very complex subject, and we appreciate you breaking that down.
You having me.
So that was fantastic. Thank you again so much.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, guys.
Dominic, awesome conversation there with Farshad. He's such a good communicator. I like how he drops into the technical, but he keeps that speed up, so he keeps us all interested in everything that he says. I was hanging on every word. You know,
thing that stood out for me particularly was he's talking about assets, and you define them as the potential impact or the potential loss to your reputation or financial loss to the organization, or to how it affects your users, both your customers and your inside employees.
Absolutely, and Farshad is such an awesome dude. Plus, he rocks an incredible beard, which blends well with us. So, but I think the really great thing about him is that he's a fantastic storyteller, and he gives great analogies for illustrating his point. And the one that stood out for me was, again, that whole notion of shared responsibility, in which businesses need to understand that just because they leverage something like Amazon AWS, that doesn't mean that their application that they've built is automatically secure. So the analogy he used of being sort of a building versus an apartment within that building. If you live in the apartment, you still you're responsible for locking the door. So really great analogies, and
A couple of masterful construction analogies.
Absolutely. Just like I said, I think that's really important to be able to make those types of points relevant to our viewers and listeners.
I couldn't agree more. So thanks for watching. You can check out our other podcasts on conversationsthatmatter.tv, and we will see you next Monday.